Let's go ahead and get started. Let me introduce our speaker today. I want to welcome everybody to our first annual Distinguished Biodiversity Speaker Seminar series by the UT Biodiversity Center. We're planning these as annual public talks by distinguished speakers who are going to talk about topics surrounding biodiversity that are of broad public interest. This series has been funded by a generous gift from Dr. Larry Gilbert, and I thank Larry for making this the seminar series possible. We planned for our first seminar in this series for spring 2020, for March 2020, and we invited Dr. Harry Greene down from Cornell to speak then. And of course, we got caught up and had to delay that with because of the COVID pandemic. But in the meantime, so we delayed it for a couple of years getting it started. But in the meantime, I'm very excited that Harry has actually moved to the University of Texas and joined us here. He spent most of his career at UC Berkeley and then at Cornell University before retiring from Cornell and moving to Texas. And Harry was an obvious choice for us for our first biodiversity seminar because he's a gifted public speaker who's worked broadly in biodiversity issues. He's written several books on biodiversity for the general public, including his award-winning book, Snakes, the Evolution of Mystery and Nature, and more recently, Tracks and Shadows, Field Biology as Art. His research is on the biology and especially the behavior and ecology of snakes, and it's internationally acclaimed. He's recognized as one of the world's leading experts on snake biology. But he's also a wonderful educator about biodiversity, and he's won the top teaching award at two different major universities, first at UC Berkeley and then at Cornell University. And I think anyone who knows him knows that his enthusiasm for biology is absolutely infective. So I'm very pleased to introduce him today to talk about rewilding the earth, rewilding our lives. Welcome, Harry, and thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Larry Gilbert, for sponsoring this series. Welcome, everybody. I'm speaking to you today from Mason, Texas, and I'm going to talk about something that's become ever dearer to my heart as the years go by. And to get us started, I'm going to ask you to kind of think about the total time span of life on Earth, which is about 4 billion years, then shrink it down to the last 50,000 or so, which is when we really see the ascendancy of humans globally in terms of essentially controlling the planet, the trajectory of the planet, and the future of the planet. I love this mural from a paper by Macaulay about 15 years ago, because it shows the last 50,000 years on a log scale. It's sort of like looking at time through the forced perspective of a wide angle lens. We're seeing all 50,000 years, but we're compressing it into the part that most interests us now, and that's the present into the future. Just to give you an idea how fast things have changed, that purple star is for 4,000 years ago, and that's when the last known mammoth was alive on Earth. I think even many of my biology colleagues think that mammoths went extinct 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, maybe even 100,000 years ago. But in fact, we know for sure we had mammoths on Earth until less than 4,000 years ago, about the same time King Rusuli was sacking Babylon. So first of all, kind of get your head around that we're going from having about 6 species of elephants and elephant relatives in North America to the present. Now, the next jump I want you to make is to think about the future. And of course, we could talk about hundreds of years into the future, even 1,000 years in the future, but I'm going to take a sort of a personal metric on that and say, let's think about what will it be like when somebody born today reaches my age, that is 76. So we're basically looking forward to about 2087 and asking, what kind of world will we have? And in particular, and this is the question that's sort of driven a lot of the emphasis of my teaching and research over the last half century, will there be room for other kinds of organisms like Texas horned lizards? I mean, look at the right-hand side of that figure, all that industrialization, both on the land and the sea. And a big question that certainly drives my passions is, will there be room for horned lizards and jaguars and Cape buffalo and snakes and so forth? So that's the issue I want to grapple with. And I'm going to grapple with it in particular with this notion of wildness. I'm going to address this from the point of view of evolution, ecology, and culture. Those are three subjects that especially fascinate me. I spent most of my career teaching about evolution and ecology, and in the last decade or so, I've veered increasingly into anthropology. I'm going to use in particular two groups of organisms that I particularly love, and that's snakes and cattle. And if you're from Texas, of course, you see the cultural connection here. Here's one of the most famous professors ever at the University of Texas, the late folklorist J. Frank Dobie, who incidentally wrote books about both rattlesnakes and longhorn cattle. So let's get started, and we have to get started by defining some terms, coming to grips with some concepts. And the first one has to do with what's been called sparing versus sharing. It was only a few years ago that the Yale Environmental Magazine called this the great debate over how to protect nature. In this context, sparing is roughly equivalent to state and especially national parks, to places that have been, insofar as possible, cut off from human influence. I mean, of course, we know there's plenty of human influence even in places like Yellowstone, but the idea is that sparing landscapes, sparing nature protects places, and sharing nature is sort of an alternative. Sharing nature is much more the norm in other countries, especially Europe. And interestingly, it's quite successful. I believe it's the case that Europe has more wolves than the United States do, for example. And I want to start out by saying I think this is a false dichotomy, that we can do both. And in fact, I'm going to argue that if we want to maximize the presence of biodiversity into the coming decades and centuries, we have got to learn how to share with nature better than we do now. This dichotomy I just mentioned kind of harks back to something that began in the early 20th century, and that is a contrast between conservationism and preservationism. Now, the first word especially, you could imagine various meanings for that, but what it means in this context is that nature was being conserved primarily for human use, as in forests for timber products. In other words, for what philosophers call instrumental values. Whereas preservationism was nature saved for its own sake, and that was coming from the likes of Teddy Roosevelt and so forth. Nature had intrinsic value. And I'm going to argue that this is a false dichotomy as well, and in particular that these notions of intrinsic and instrumental value are actually quite blurry and maybe not even so useful anymore. In that context, one of my two favorite pieces of art in the world is shown over here on the right. It's from Seminole Canyon State Historical Park out west of Del Rio. It's a piece of archaic Pecos rock art that's about a 9-foot tall cat losing something red out of its mouth. It's about half full of presumably that red substance. And we could ask, does this piece of art have intrinsic value? Did it have intrinsic value back then? Does it now? Would it have intrinsic value for everybody, and so on and so forth? I personally view it as priceless, but I don't think it's intrinsically value. I think it has value because me and other humans place value on it, as they surely did in the archaic Pecos. Here's a couple more words, wild and wilderness. Now these are getting ever more problematic. Wild and wilderness, as typically defined, especially in the United States by environmentalists, stem from that preservationist tradition. Wild is typically said to mean self-willed, outside the influence of humans, and wilderness is untrammeled. It's at most walked upon slightly by us. And there's this widespread saying, take only photos, leave only footprints. It's sort of emblematic of how we both define and treat wilderness areas. And I hope you can tell already, I think these false dichotomies I've just set up, including this one between self-willed and untrammeled and presence of humans, are both unrealistic and misleading. And I think they're unrealistic and misleading from philosophical points of view, from anthropological points of view, and even ecologically. And I'll try to convince you of that. Okay, now let's get a little closer to this notion of intrinsic value and ask why something might be intrinsically valuable. And to do this, I'm going to show you one of the most beautiful animals I've ever encountered in my life. And I'm talking about individual animals. I've been on foot in Africa. I've seen jaguars in the field and lions in the field and elephants in the field and rhinos and marine iguanas. And I've had the great fortune to travel a lot and see a lot of nature. And this is one of the most beautiful creatures I've ever seen. It's about a 3-foot long lance-headed pit viper called an urutu in Portuguese. It's native to Brazil. I encountered this snake crossing a road in a Brazilian national park, jumped out of the car, took pictures of it when it snapped into its defensive display and then watched it crawl on into the grasslands. I think the color pattern of the snake is absolutely mind-blowingly pretty with those silver inverted dumbbells and so forth. And so think about what I just said. Think about that Darwin in the closing pages of The Origin of the Species talked about there's grandeur in this view of life from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful have evolved. And let's ask ourselves if an Uru-2 has to be beautiful to have value, or the aesthetics of wildness more complicated. But let's let Charles Darwin weigh in on that. Here's what he said about Bothrops alternatus, the Uru-2. The expression on this snake's face was hideous and fierce. I never saw anything more ugly. So clearly this matter of beauty and value and so forth is controversial. It's confounded by individual preferences, which are in turn based on all sorts of individual experiences and cultural traditions and so forth. We need to come up with a better way of asking questions about valuing nature than these simple dichotomies. Well, it turns out several centuries ago, a famous German philosopher named Immanuel Kant, in one of his several large volumes, this one from 1790 called A Critique of Judgment, suggested that objects are beautiful. That is, individual entities. It could be this snake. Whereas the sublime, Kant said, transcends individual objects. It does that by supplying context. So what I'm suggesting, and this actually comes from the work of a man named Ross Keister, is that if we think about objects and nature and change through time of nature, we can imbue all this with a sublime aesthetic that transcends the individual parts of nature. We can think of habitats and organisms as having sublime aesthetics. Okay, let's take this notion of sublime and let's look at a few things in terms of adding context. And the first of all is that I think if we just get out into nature and look around, we'll soon realize that we've always gone beyond footprints and photographs. We've always been part of nature. And this first hit me. I'm embarrassed to say I didn't realize this until some 20 years ago when I began to spend some time in Africa. You can't apply this sort of notion of wild and wilderness as no human influence if you go to the continent of our origin as a species and as a lineage, okay? We've been, as humans, in Africa for more than 2 million years, and we've certainly been influencing Africa for more than 2 million years as humans. So that's the first point of this, is that I realize, and I think we all can sort of face up to the fact that we've always been, wherever we've been present, part of nature. And it's also true in North America and the New World. For at least 15 to 20,000 years, maybe as much as 30,000 years or more, we've been here. And we were not inconsequential in terms of the ecological communities we persisted and existed in and so forth. I love this mural from the Whitty Museum in San Antonio depicting archaic Pecos people using rabbit nets, which have actually been found and studied, to drive rabbits into fences and catch them for food and fur and so forth. Another thing about sort of going out into nature and placing what we see in a broader context is that I think when you're around dangerous animals, and this is something that actually really first hit me for the first time in Africa on foot among the megafauna there, when you're among dangerous animals, you are always alert and sometimes you're even terrified. And I'm going to explore this a bit more with both snakes and horned herding mammals in just a minute. Let's talk about snakes for a bit. So I've spent a lot of time studying snakes, and in the last 15 years, I've gotten more and more interested in the interactions between snakes and primates. I could give a whole talk on this, and I hope you invite me back sometime to do that, David. For right now, I'm just going to stress a couple of things. It looks like snakes and primates, the group that we belong to, that includes lemurs, monkeys, and apes, we've been engaged in what I call a 75 million year long deadly dialogue. And that involves both monkeys, lemurs, and apes killing us, and us killing monkeys, apes, and lemurs. Because snakes that can kill and eat primates are older than primates as a group, I think it started with snakes getting down hard on our relatives and on us, and later we begin to reciprocally influence them. Just one example of how this happens right up to modern times, including people who live more subsistence lifestyles than we do now, with Tom Hedlund, an anthropologist from Dallas. I did a study of hunter-gatherers in the northern Philippines in the late 1960s, and these were people that are about half my size. And it turned out that among 120 AGTA that Tom surveyed, 26% of the adult males had survived predatory attacks from reticulated pythons like the one shown in this picture. There were 6 fatalities in the memory of these 120 AGTA he surveyed from reticulated python predation. And it turned out the AGTA also ate the pythons. And when they butchered the pythons, would find the same prey species, deer, pigs, and monkeys in the python stomachs that they also hunted. So just imagine the complexity of the relationship between these pythons, these giant reticulated pythons, and the AGTA people. Now, at the same time, there's some evidence, at least, that we've influenced snake evolution. This looks a little complicated, but let me just tell you the simple story here. All those branching lines that go back deeper and deeper and deeper in time, back to about 35 million years ago, are the family tree of the snakes that include cobras. And it turns out that cobras as a group originated about, 15 to 20 million years ago. Within cobras, which is an old world group of snakes, very deadly snakes, 3 different times spitting has arisen. That's the ability to essentially spray venom out of the snake's fangs into the eyes of an aggressor. It's happened 3 times, and at least 2 of those times are associated with human evolution. We haven't been able to date the 3rd time yet, the one shown by the question, but for the first time, this one right up here, that date for the origin of those African spitted cobras corresponds almost precisely with the divergence between chimpanzees and our lineage. And the second arrow down here corresponds almost precisely the origin of spitting cobras in Asia and the arrival of Homo erectus on the Asian mainland. So the evidence is weak at this point, but it's a very suggestive possibility that we actually caused humans and our lineage, the evolution of spitting cobras, 3 different times. So what does this do? How has it affected my own thinking about caring about snakes and trying to get people to conserve snakes? I've been using this quote for about 30 years by a Senegalese conservationist named Baba Diome. I love the quote because it seemed to encapsulate relationships among doing research, teaching what we find out, and convincing people to love and care about things that might be unpopular. So you can read the quote there. We'll conserve what we love what we understand, and understand what we're taught. And what thinking harder about snakes and primates has done to me, and I have to admit, I now live in a very rural part of Texas where people actually still have reason to worry about snake bite. That's also influenced my thinking on this. And so now I would change the quote a little bit. I'd say we'll conserve what we love and don't fear too much. We'll love what we understand and isn't too risky. And we'll understand what we're taught to appreciate safely. That is to say, to kind of just spell out the lesson from snakes. If we really want to conserve and coexist with things that can potentially hurt us, we've essentially got to manage that risk down to where it's low enough that most people are willing to accept it. Now let's switch to horns and big herbivores, animals that live in herds. I think if I showed you these 5 pictures and I reminded you of this dichotomy between things that are wild and intrinsically valuable and things that are domestic and instrumentally valuable, you'd probably throw them into these 2 groups. It's pretty obvious that Cape buffalo and musk oxen are wild. It's pretty obvious that cattle are domestic. They owe their existence in their current form to us selecting them in various ways, and they are therefore instrumentally valuable. But I'd like to suggest a different way to look at these 5 kinds of organisms, and that is in terms of the presence of horns or not. It's now very, very common to poll cattle, either mechanically or more frequently genetically, that is to not let them have horns. And I'd ask you to just play the little thought experiment. I'm gonna, suppose I challenged you to run across a football field 5 times, and each time there was one of these 5 groups in it. My bet is that you would feel a little differently about running across that football field the 4 times it contained the 2 kinds of animals on the upper panel or the animals in the lower right and the lower left, compared to running across that football field with some polled Herefords like in this other slide. So I think there's a certain aspect of this business of domestication that's not quite so simple, and the domestication can be wilder or less depending on various circumstances, in this case, the presence of horns. Let's explore that a little farther with my favorite kind of horned domestic organism, the longhorn. It's been my huge pleasure for the last dozen years or so to spend a lot of time on actually David Hillis's ranch on his with his longhorn herd. I spent literally hundreds of hours watching longhorns and getting to know them as individuals and as a group. And I've come to realize they have a fascinating social structure and that they use their horns in very complex ways that I think are often analogous to what we do with our hands. I don't think it's a stretch of imagination to say that a longhorn essentially does much of its relating to its environment, its fellow longhorns, and other species with its horns. One of the results of this is people that have longhorns don't lose their little calves to predators, and the reason is, would you want to mess with Shonuff if she had a calf around and these things were facing you? This is actually a coyote found gored on the Double Helix Ranch by a longhorn that had a calf. Now it turns out it's more interesting than that. I have a sister-in-law that's an anthropologist at the Smithsonian, and one time while we were actually searching for snake artifacts among the anthropological resources there, we encountered a number of 19th century Plains Indian objects, artworks, and so forth that were based on or included parts of longhorns. So in the lower left here, you can see two different Comanche war shields, one viewed from the inside, one viewed from the outside. These are pre-conquest. So these were war shields used in warfare. This is a longhorn tail switch. So this part of the tail of a cow is called the switch. It's used for swatting flies. This is a longhorn tail switch attached to a war shield. And on this war shield on the inside, if you look carefully here, you can see there's actually a beautiful icon of a longhorn. And Candace Greene did an analysis of this art, including many interviews of Comanche and Kiowa informants. And she was able to make a strong case that longhorns in the iconography of early 19th century Plains Indians were not European colonist domestic animals. They were power icons. They were portrayed in exactly the same context and often the exact same postures as were bison. And they were presumably, for that reason, used as power symbols. So where does this get us? And I'm going to tell you where I think it takes us. The first thing is, I think, as I said earlier, this notion of land sparing versus land sharing is a false dichotomy. I can't imagine how most of the animals that I've come to really care about in particular, and the habitats and biomes, aggregations of plants and animals and so forth that I really care about, I can't imagine how they can persist for long in the future with just a land sparing approach. And if we speak about Texas in particular, where most of our land is in private ownership, we have relatively few national parks, some US Forest Service land. I don't believe we have any BLM land. If we do, it's not much. Most land in Texas where biodiversity could persist is private, and much of it is ranch land or otherwise used in agriculture to varying degrees. So my conclusion at this point is that a real hope for biodiversity is to find ways to coexist with an agricultural economy in the broad sense. Part of that involves recognizing that wildness never could have been really about keeping people out of the definition and out of the picture. I think the notion of defining wildness and wilderness in terms of absence of humans, absence of significant human influence, is just completely vacuous in terms of any justification ecologically or anthropologically. And instead, I suggest we can think about wildness and wilderness in ways that are realistic, that involve having big herbivores, okay? Having predators, including top predators, having the scavengers that clean up after them. There's some fascinating evidence that a healthy population of scavengers, like having several species of vultures, cuts down on transmission of wildlife diseases and wildlife diseases to cattle. And all these organisms, in my ideal, my dream, are going to interact at least occasionally with humans. And that means that we're going to have to make it possible for them to interact without humans being at much risk, at least, for being hurt by them. Now, what are the possibilities? Well, and let me say that if you think of wildness like I just defined it, maximum wildness will exist in places where we've got big horned herbivores and where we've got top predators like bears and mountain lions and even jaguars. That is possibly the last jaguar killed in Texas in the photograph on your left. It's from 1946 down in the valley. Ranchers in Texas call jaguars tiger cats. There are at least 2 or 3 creeks with signs on them still today called Tiger Creek. This one's from McCullough County, just north of where I'm sitting right now. And it's so impressive to think about the fact that only 100 years ago, jaguars were not uncommon in the Texas Hill Country. Okay, today we have none. In fact, as far as I know, the closest jaguars to us are probably in central Tamaulipas in northern Mexico. We don't have any right now. There are not any right waiting to cross into Texas, but one can wonder, could they be here someday? Now, if we're going to get to the kind of place I'm talking about, I think we have to view ourselves and nature a little differently than I grew up thinking about it. And a view that I've come to really respect a lot and embrace is one that comes from indigenous ideals. I first read a paper 21 years ago by a Raramuri, we call them Tarahumara in English, environmental scholar Enrique Salmon. And Enrique coined the term ecological kinship. And I want to be clear that although I can state this simply as we can take from nature with respect and gratitude, with moderation and reciprocity, for Native Americans like Enrique, it's more complicated than that. And I'm not sure, in fact, I doubt that I can fully fathom exactly how it is for Enrique. For Enrique, it's more than just ecological kinship, which is the main way I think about it. It's literally about a relationship. So Enrique grew up in a tradition of eco-kinship in which he and the people he come from thought of nature as relatives. Okay, so they're sort of blending spiritual, genetic notions of relationship and ecological notions and so forth. All that complexity admitted, I think this is a great way to think about how we can be and could be. And that is to, first of all, admit that we do take from nature, including even mortally at times when we kill animals to eat, use their fur for clothing, on and on and on. But we can do that with respect and gratitude. We can do it with moderation, that is to say, in a sustainable manner. And we can act reciprocally. We can express our gratitude through reciprocal support of other kinds of organisms. So that's a sort of mindset, the spiritual, philosophical mindset to which I aspire for a workable coexistence with biodiversity. Could we do that? Well, let's see, huh? I don't really know the answer, but I'd like to think we can. Suppose we combine Salmon's notion of reciprocal eco-kinship. Suppose we think of J. Frank Dobie's old Diamondbacks as our grouchy neighbors that we have to kind of be careful about, that if we're careful about it, we can largely eliminate the dangers associated with being them. What if we thought of longhorns as proxies for truly native herbivores like bison? Could we then have wildness thrive and even be maximal on working landscapes? Could we go global with this? And I think the possibility is there. We're not the only place that has longhorn cattle that exist in a deep local heritage. So here's one I'm looking forward to studying in the field later this year. These are Scotch Highland cattle, or as they call them in Scotland, herricous. And these are, like our longhorns, a regionally adapted breed. They have a diverse diet. They don't just graze, they browse, they eat plants that other cattle in the same environment in Scotland will refuse to eat, just as longhorns do. Like longhorns, they birth easily and defend their calves from predators. They produce lean, healthy meat, and they're culturally relevant and beautiful. Now, I'm sure I got people listening to this and thinking, you gotta be crazy. You think all of a sudden we're just gonna start ranching longhorns everywhere and we're not gonna ship them off to Kansas to be slaughtered and so forth and so forth. I know that there are many parts of this puzzle that are beyond my expertise, but I have some hope. And I got a couple of glimpses how these pieces might start to fit together just within the last month. In the February 9th issue of Texas Monthly, there's an article about a woman named Christy Miller who started a slaughterhouse out in Brewster County. It's the first Brewster County slaughterhouse in a long time. And she is providing a way for people in places like Alpine to eat meat that was raised in Brewster County, something that's actually not very easy to do in Texas these days. Best of all, the article started. The first sentence of the article, a black Corrientes steer looks around and shakes his horns. So here's a local slaughterhouse in Texas producing meat that makes money for local people and feeds local people. And the cattle have horns that I believe probably help protect their calves from predators, including perhaps some big ones in the future. 2 days later, on the Mason County Facebook page, look to the lower right here. Huge mountain lion spotted this morning at Tres Chivos Viejos Ranch on 1871 on top of the hill where the big red mailbox is. Keep y'all's eyes open out here, guys. We, right now, as far as I know, only have breeding populations of mountain lions in western Texas, but we have site records increasingly into the hill country. We have black bear records increasingly into the hill country. Maybe you know that nationwide, this is a common pattern. There are mountain lions showing up in Missouri now. There was one mountain lion that made it all the way from South Dakota to Connecticut before it hit with a car. These large apex predators, as they're called, will return if given the opportunity and if we find ways to successfully coexist with them. So I hope I've convinced you to kind of think harder about what wildness means. I hope you think a little differently about our mascots, the Texas Longhorns here at UT. I'd like to convince you that not only do they coexist with wildflowers and dung beetles and predators and rattlesnakes and dust, but they're magnificent, generally amiable animals. Their meat is lean and tasty. I'd love to see a slogan in Texas: keep Texas wild, proud, and healthy, raise Longhorns. And with that, I'll close. I'm happy to take questions. I know you could ask me if I'm hopeful about whether there'll be jaguars back in Texas today. I doubt it in my lifetime, but I wouldn't say it's impossible. I wouldn't say it's impossible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ari. That was X for that wonderful talk. If people would like to ask a question, I think you can raise your hand and then I can turn on your speaker. But you won't be able to talk until if you raise your hand, I'll be able to turn it on. So feel free to do so. All right, there's one that I'm just getting okay. I think you should be able to unmute, Mary.
Hi, Mary Poteet.
I think you have to unmute you should be able to unmute it now. Unmute. Mary, I think you have to click on your end, the unmute button. You're trying, okay. Well, if you want to put your question in the chat, Mary, that's another way to try to do it if you can't find a way to unmute. Okay, there's a question from Mary. She says, from a student, why have we switched from coexisting with nature to exploiting the nature around us?
Well, I don't think those two things are exactly opposite. In fact, we've always been exploiting nature around us, just as other species exploit nature around them. So we've always, throughout our history as people and even farther back in time, used aspects of nature for food, for shelter, for at least the last million years or more, clothing. So the question is not, to me, whether we use things, it's whether we do it in a sustainable, grateful, and reciprocating manner. Now, maybe what you're getting at is that it seems like the balance is tipped very heavily in terms of just exploitation. And I agree with you, as we move ever more and more towards 9 billion people who are consuming more and more and more, then it becomes more and more a question of overuse and a tougher time coexisting with healthy populations of these other species.
Okay, I think the next question comes from Robert Rayburn. I think you should be able to talk, Robert.
Can you
Hey,
hear me?
Robert.
Hello
I
there.
can, Robert. How are you? Nice to hear you.
Again, thank you for a wonderful seminar here. My question is we talk about preparedness and conserving and working together with our native coexisting species to set aside land and to protect maybe our agricultural land and some of our lands that we are developing on. My belief is that in order, we cannot create these islands of isolated places that are ideal for our plants. What concerns me the most is the protection of our riparian corridors, which are really wildlife corridors. And I think I will refer to it as a string of pearls, that if we don't connect our corridors that we set aside as conservation areas without these easements that connect them all, we really have restricted. It's almost like all of us being on individual islands in the Pacific and thinking that we're connected to each other. I'm a very strong believer in protecting our riparian areas and conserving the habitats that we have, because I do believe that all of us in the United States are connected through our drainage ways, and that sometimes is also the most favorite of where we want to hang out or live, right, or actually impede. So that movement and support, I think, is critical for both the species, both us and the protection of the natural world. So I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Thank you, Robert. Nice to hear from you. I know we're neighbors. Here's what this makes me think about. It gets into areas that are definitely not my expertise. So I don't want to either portray myself as an expert on some of these things or claim that I know fulsome answers to what they involve. But I just don't see any way we can save biodiversity unless it's worth it to the people who own the land. So I think we have a situation now in which there are many of us, including many people who live in cities, who care about there being jaguars out there somewhere. And the people who live in cities are basically not, in some sense, pulling their weight relative to the people who live out on the land. How would we do this? Well, I think we'll someday hopefully have a situation in which landowners are actually paid to save land for biodiversity. They'll get biodiversity credits for certain kinds of organisms on their properties. This is being done in Africa already. There are places where camera traps allow a group of people holding a landscape to actually gain money for their group by proving that they have maintained particular species in that landscape. Carbon credits. I mean, grasslands are fantastic places to sequester carbon, help combat climate change. We should be essentially paying people who own those grasslands what they deserve to get for helping the rest of us combat climate change. So I agree with everything you said. I don't think that economic mechanisms are nearly all in place to let us reach some sort of dream of connectivity and sustainability. And like I said, I see these little glimmers of hope, like suddenly having an actual slaughterhouse in Brewster County and using horned cattle there. If we're ever going to have jaguars back in Texas, it'll involve something like that, I think.
Okay, great. There's a question in the chat from Katarina Myers in the Oakland Zoo. And she writes, Harry, what are your thoughts on the role of species survival plans, captive breeding, and managed rewilding for wildlife rehabilitation programs?
Wow. Well, hi, Kat. How are you? Kat was a student of mine quite a long time ago, and I'm really glad to thank you for coming to my talk. I think all those things are super important. If we decided, for example, to put jaguars back in Texas, it might have to involve captive bred individuals. It might have to involve semi-contained areas, at least when it started. So I don't view any of these approaches to conservation as independent or important on their own. Either way, I think these are all part of a much larger picture of striving to have working ecosystems in which we have maximum wildness, as indicated by the presence of big herbivores like horned cattle, or wild big herbivores, like having apex predators and so forth. So everything you mentioned, I view as an important part of the mix.
We have next questions from Larry Gilbert, who is, of course, also the sponsor of this series. So thank you very much, Larry, for your sponsorship. And what's your question?
Hi, Harry. That was a brilliant talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
So you and I have talked about this. You've heard me talk about this too, about the role of the large ranches in conservation, in the sense of shifting from strictly cattle to incorporating hunting leases, which fosters the preservation of habitat so they'll have quality wildlife. There is an element of this that concerns me, in that there's a tendency for the economy to drift toward hunters wanting very expensive trophy animals, as opposed to, and paying for that, as opposed to paying for the experience of being in nature and sitting out there trying to hunt something, maybe with a bow or something, and being willing to pay for that experience. And that is more comparable to bird watchers not really wanting to pay for watching birds. It's a non-consumptive use of wildlife. And one reason ranchers are less interested in ecotourism is that people that assume they're not consuming anything are not as willing to pay, say, what a trophy hunter will pay for. So this is where the users of these kinds of wild lands that are owned by private individuals, where the education and our attitudes about that come in. And I wonder if you've thought much about that issue.
I've only thought about a little, and actually part of what you said is actually inspiring me right now to think about something. And in fact, I just, this last 2 months, hosted somebody on our land to hunt deer for the first time. And we were only allowing killing of does. This person was hunting for all the reasons you talked about. He wanted to find out what it was like to be out in nature and take responsibility for his own carnivory. He wasn't interested in trophies whatsoever. He wanted to be a smart, safe, responsible, respectful hunter. And I think, and I've read things about this too, including in the New York Times not too long ago, that I think there's a lot of people out there actually that would like to try hunting as a means of eating healthier meat, both healthier environmentally and healthier medically. And they actually have trouble getting those opportunities. They need a certain amount of mentorship and so forth. They probably don't have the money to pay what people are paying to hunt really trophy bucks. But you know, we need a lot of deer taken in Texas that aren't trophy bucks. So I don't have the mechanics of this worked out at all, but I'm suddenly wondering if you're pointing to a real opportunity. You know, we have ranchers with all kinds of doe management tags, and then we have people out there that would probably like to learn to hunt.
Yeah.
So thanks for that. I'm going to keep thinking about what you said.
There's an anonymous question or submitted by anonymous attendee that I think is a little bit confused by what you said about longhorns. They say, so longhorns were not introduced to North America by Europeans. And I think their question is they're seeing you talk about the longhorns as part of the native fauna, maybe. But you want to address that?
Yes, and actually, thank you very much for that question. I may have gone a little too fast through the longhorn part because I want to make sure I didn't take too much time. Longhorns are part of a really fascinating situation and question in conservation biology. So the deal is that cattle were originally domesticated in Eurasia from a now extinct, gigantic proto-cattle animal called the auroch. And it turns out that domestication occurred thousands of years ago. The auroch persisted into the 1600s as a species before it went extinct. And cattle breeds are, of course, spread and differentiated all over the world. What happened in the New World is that Columbus brought cattle to an island in the Caribbean around 1493 or so. I don't remember the exact first year. And within a couple of years, Columbus's ships took some of those Iberian cattle to mainland, what we would now call mainland Mexico, and to Florida. Ponce de Leon actually took the ones to Florida. And it turns out those Iberian cattle had about 500 years to evolve adaptations to those different situations. Such that today in Florida, we have something called cracker cattle and their derivative called piney woods cattle in Alabama and Mississippi that are adapted to subtropical conditions. For example, they resist subtropical diseases. They don't get rotten hooves or any other problems from standing in water all day long. They look different from Iberian cattle and from longhorns. On the other hand, the ones that went to Mexico, to what we now call Mexico, it evolved in a semi-arid environment into what are variously called criollo, corriente, and a particular subset called longhorns. So I would argue that longhorns are North American cattle. I mean, longhorns as longhorns evolved in this context of the American Southwest. Cracker cattle as cracker cattle are North American cattle, just as Scottish hairy coos are Scottish cattle as a lineage. So I hope that helps explain it. If you want to say, well, if the ancestors didn't arise here, then they're not North American. Well, that's true. Longhorns aren't native in that sense, but as longhorns, they are.
Okay, let's see. I don't know. Can you see the chat, Harry, or you want me to read these out to you?
I think you'll have to read them, David. I can't seem to see it.
Okay, there's a question from Dick Tracy, who asks, he says, breaking down the barriers between those who value wild biota and lawyers can be without compromise. For example, I think wildlife and solar farms can coexist, as they often do in Northern Europe, but lawyers are afraid of liability associated with that model and insist that solar farms be places fenced and bladed to be devoid of vegetation and associated wildlife. You have any kind of comments on that?
Hi, Dick. It's a great question and comment, but I don't have any particular expertise on that. I certainly share frustration about legal complexities and how they affect being a biologist and being a conservationist and being a landowner, but I don't have any special expertise on that particular problem.
Okay, I think you have a question from David Johnson.
Hey, Harry, can you hear me?
I can, Dave. How are you?
Yeah, good.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming.
Fantastic talk as always. Yeah, and back to the longhorns. Actually, the last question about their origin brought up another part of my question. So I'll say that first. Why do longhorns of all these derivatives have the longest horns? And I'll just follow up. And then the other thing is, I got the impression that you said that they interact, quite a bit using their horns. And I assume that means other than just predator avoidance. But the only thing you showed was a gored coyote. So
yes,
maybe you can just talk a little bit about that.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So for your first question, I don't have any specifics on that. David might actually want to say something about that in a minute. I know that to some extent, longhorns today have been selected by humans for a particular length of horn and configuration and so forth. So longhorns as 2022 longhorns of a certain dimension, that may be significantly due to human selection.
Right.
But having horns and having relatively long horns seems to be something about being in the brush country of the Southwest, because the cattle in Florida and the southeastern US, the cracker cattle and the piney woods cattle, have horns that are more lyriform. They're shorter and they go up more like this. Mm-hmm. And they're pretty consistent within that breed and consistently different from what you see in longhorns and criollos. For your second question, it's just incredible to be around longhorns. They do things. They scratch their butts with their horns. They move food within reach with their horns. We have hay for our longhorns and kind of a slatted wooden feeder thing, and our longhorns can turn sideways and stick a horn in there and pull out a huge hunk of hay to where they can get it with their mouth. No. They use their horns all the time for social relationships. The simplest thing between an animal who's obviously dominant to another one is just a head shake. And then, by the way, the same horn use occurs in Scottish Highland cattle. So a dominant longhorn cow will come up to a subordinate cow that she knows is subordinate, just shake her head barely, it's subtle even, and that subordinate cow will move out of the way from where the dominant wants to go. If things are not so clear, they do things like whack each other behind the ankle or the knee, whack each other on the horns. I've never seen one do what I would call a goring motion with the horns. So complex social interactions for sure, manipulation of the environment to get food for sure, protection from predators for sure. It's significant that this whole family, the Bovidae, both sexes have horns. So it's something that both sexes do.
Yeah, cool. I
Thanks,
just,
Dave.
I remembered, I don't know if it was Kelly or you that posted something on Facebook of a longhorn spinning a bucket with with one of their horns. And
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine what the selective advantage of that would be, but
Yeah.
thanks.
Yep. Thanks for coming.
Yes, okay, we're sort of related to that. There's a question from Greg Murray is saying, has anyone collected data systematically on injuries or mortality in horned versus polled cattle in the same areas of North America?
That is such a great question. And to my knowledge, no, but there is some anecdotal support. So we know that right here in Mason County, this is actually stuff David's told me, not my, I've only been here 2 years, but David's never lost a calf to a predator. And longhorn calves are smaller than the calves of polled cattle in general. So longhorn calves should be even more vulnerable in terms of just their size. A newborn longhorn is certainly within the size range of what a coyote could take down. And yet the double helix ranch has never in over 25 years lost a calf to a predator. Recently, there was a study published by some people working in northern Mexico where their primary goal of the study was to ask the question, if we supplement natural prey where there are jaguars, and mountain lions, will they prey less on cattle? So what these people did within a relatively small area was actually supplement the population of collared peccaries, of javelinas. And sure enough, predation on cattle went down when more peccaries were available. And I wrote the author of that study, who's worked a lot in northern Mexico, and asked her about horns. And she said that the lore among the cowboys is that horned cattle lose calves less often than do polled cattle.
And I imagine that is the case, having watched my horned cattle actually defend their calves. They'll put the calves in the middle and get in a circle and stick their horns out, and whether it's from a dog or from coyotes or whatever, and they can use those horns extremely effectively. You saw the gored coyote that Harry showed you from a coyote that couldn't be dissuaded. So I think they actually work extremely effectively. I think we have several more questions, but we're probably going to have to wrap this up. I'm going to end it with a question from a student sent in by Mary Poteet, and a student from her class that's watching, I think. And the question is, how does sustainable farming and ranching differ in the USA, Africa, Asia, and Europe? How would farmers in these places be able to rewild? Would they use similar strategies?
Wow, that is just an incredibly wonderful question. And I don't know the answer. I think that's the only fair thing for me to say, is that that's way beyond my expertise. I've been in Latin America a fair amount. I've been in Africa some. I've barely been on the Asian mainland, just in Vietnam. I can't imagine that the particulars won't vary a lot. So I can tell you the cattle vary a lot, for example, in terms of the shape of their horns, the way they're managed by people on foot or not, and so on and so forth. The kinds of local predators will vary a lot, even within fairly short distances. For example, in North America, jaguars don't get over about 150 pounds. In South America, especially in the Pantanal and in Amazonia, jaguars reach 300, 350 pounds. So what jaguars can do in those two different places vis-a-vis cattle, for example, could be quite different, and the complexities of coexisting with jaguars could be different. So I'm sorry I don't have an exact answer for you. I'm sure it must vary, and I'm sure those differences will have to be addressed if there's any hope for coexistence. And by the way, I think those differences will include cultural differences that have to be considered. Thanks for your question, though.
All right.
Could I just say one more thing, David?
Yeah.
I'm easy to find on the internet. I'm easy to find. I welcome emails. If I mention some paper and you'd like to get a PDF of it, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to continue this conversation by correspondence too.
Well, thank you very much, Harry, for a very provocative and interesting talk. And I certainly enjoyed it. It looks like everybody else did too. We had a great attendance and lots of great questions. So thanks very much for helping us all think about these issues. So thank you, Harry. And
Thanks for
and
coming, y'all.
everybody for coming. I hope you've all enjoyed it.